June 7, 2021, a sprawling hunting property in South Carolina known as Moselle. Near the dog kennels, two members of one of the Low Country's most prominent families are dead. 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh has been shot with a rifle. Her 22-year-old son, Paul, has been killed with a shotgun. Alex Murdaugh tells investigators he came home and discovered the bodies. For months, he insists he was not there when his wife and son were killed. Then investigators uncover a video recorded on Paul's phone just minutes before prosecutors believe the murders occurred. And in the background, there is a voice, Alex Murdaugh's voice. That video would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a murder trial watched across America. In March 2023, a jury convicted Murdaugh of murdering his wife and son. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. For many people, that seemed like the end of the story. It wasn't. More than 3 years later, the conviction is gone. A new murder trial is coming. And now, Murdaugh's lawyers are attacking the case from several directions at once. They are challenging the original murder indictments. They are questioning testimony given by a key state investigator. They are fighting over how much of Murdaugh's financial crimes a new jury should be allowed to hear. They want his previous testimony scrutinized. And perhaps most intriguingly, they want new testing performed on DNA found beneath Maggie Murdaugh's fingernails. DNA belonging to an unidentified male. The defense argues that modern testing could potentially identify that person. Prosecutors have suggested the DNA may be little more than a distraction. But that leaves a critical question. Could evidence that played only a minor role in the first trial become one of the biggest issues in the second? And could Alex Murdaugh's lawyers dismantle a murder case that once produced a guilty verdict in less than 3 hours? To understand why these questions are back, we first have to understand something crucial. Alex Murdaugh did not receive a new trial because South Carolina's highest court decided he was innocent. The court did not determine that another person killed Maggie and Paul. It did not throw out the prosecution's evidence. Instead, the South Carolina Supreme Court focused on what happened around the jury. Former Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill was accused of improperly influencing jurors during the original trial. In May 2026, the South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously overturned Murdaugh's murder convictions. The justices concluded that Hill's conduct had improperly attacked Murdaugh's credibility in front of jurors and compromised his right to a fair trial. That distinction matters. The verdict disappeared. The murder charges did not. South Carolina immediately prepared to prosecute him again, and Alex Murdaugh remained behind bars anyway. Long before his murder conviction was overturned, the former lawyer had admitted to an extraordinary series of financial crimes. He stole millions of dollars from clients and others who trusted him. He is serving lengthy state and federal prison sentences for those crimes. So even without the murder convictions, Murdaugh was never walking out of prison. But the legal battle over Maggie and Paul's deaths had effectively returned to the starting line. A new judge was assigned, Circuit Judge Deborah McCaslin. On June 29, 2026, Murdaugh appeared publicly in court for the first time since his murder convictions were overturned. The scene looked very different from the 2023 trial. Then, he had appeared before jurors in civilian clothing. Now, he entered court wearing an orange prison uniform and restraints. Judge McCaslin began laying out a schedule. A second murder trial was tentatively set to begin with jury selection on April 5, 2027. But before a jury ever hears the case, the judge must resolve a series of battles that could determine what that trial eventually looks like, and perhaps whether certain parts of the prosecution's case survive at all. One of the most dramatic moves comes from Murdaugh's defense team, led by attorneys Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. They are asking the court to dismiss the murder and weapons indictments, not merely suppress one piece of evidence, not simply move the trial, dismiss the charges. Their argument attacks what happened before the original trial even began. The defense alleges that false or inaccurate physical evidence was presented to the grand jury that indicted Murdaugh. Their motion specifically targets testimony connected to South Carolina Law Enforcement Division investigator David Owen. The allegations are serious, but they are allegations from the defense. They have not been established as fact by the court. And that is precisely why this part of the battle could become complicated. A judge considering such a claim may need testimony, documents, and additional evidence before deciding whether anything improper happened, and, if so, whether it was serious enough to affect the indictments. One former federal prosecutor described dismissing the case on these grounds as an enormous request. And even if the defense proves that some statement made during the grand jury process was inaccurate, that does not automatically mean the murder case disappears. The judge would have to determine the legal consequences. But this is only one front. The second involves money. At Alex Murdaugh's first murder trial, prosecutors did something unusual and extremely powerful. They did not present the killings as an isolated act. Instead, they built a much larger story around Murdaugh's life. According to prosecutors, his financial world was collapsing. For years, Murdaugh had stolen money from clients and his law firm. By June 2021, questions were closing in. Prosecutors argued that murdering Maggie and Paul created a crisis that temporarily shifted attention away from his financial misconduct. It was a motive theory, and it allowed jurors to hear extensive evidence about theft, fraud, and deception. That evidence was devastating to Murdaugh's credibility. But South Carolina's Supreme Court later expressed concern about just how far the first trial went into those financial crimes. The court did not rule that every reference to Murdaugh's financial misconduct must be excluded from a retrial. Instead, the issue now becomes one of limits. How much is necessary to explain the prosecution's alleged motive? And at what point does evidence about stolen money stop explaining motive and simply make the defendant look like a terrible person? Judge McCaslin will have to draw that line. If the financial evidence is significantly reduced, prosecutors may lose part of the larger narrative that helped them explain why a wealthy lawyer would suddenly murder his wife and son. But they still have something extremely important. Alex Murdaugh's own words. During the original investigation, Murdaugh repeatedly said he had not been at the kennels shortly before Maggie and Paul were killed. Then Paul's phone changed everything. At approximately 8:44 that night, Paul recorded a short video involving a dog at the kennels. Multiple people who knew the family identified Alex's voice in the recording. The video placed him at the scene only minutes before prosecutors believe Maggie and Paul were killed. When Murdaugh took the witness stand at his 2023 trial, he finally admitted it. He had been there. He admitted lying to investigators, but he continued to insist he did not kill his wife and son. He blamed his earlier lies, in part, on paranoia connected to his opioid addiction. That decision to testify may now create one of the biggest strategic problems for him. A retrial normally gives the defense an opportunity to rethink its approach. But Murdaugh has already testified under oath for hours. Prosecutors know what he said. They know where his explanations are vulnerable. They know how he answered difficult questions. And if the judge permits his former testimony to be used in the new trial, the state may have access to his words, even if Murdaugh decides not to testify again. In other words, unlike the first trial, neither side is entering this courtroom blind. But then there is the DNA, and this is where the new trial could move into genuinely different territory. DNA from an unidentified male was found under Maggie Murdaugh's fingernails. The defense wants that material examined again using newer forensic technology. They have proposed testing by Othram, a Texas laboratory known for advanced forensic genetic genealogy work. According to the defense, the DNA could potentially point toward another person. They also want to preserve the limited biological material because additional testing could consume some or all of the remaining sample. On its face, unidentified male DNA beneath a murder victim's fingernails sounds explosive. But forensic evidence almost never exists without context. The key question is not simply, whose DNA is it? Investigators also have to ask, how did it get there? When did it get there? And does it have any connection to the killings? Human beings constantly transfer biological material. DNA can come from direct contact. It can also move indirectly through objects or other people. Finding someone's DNA does not automatically mean that person attacked the victim. During earlier proceedings, prosecutors noted that investigators had not found evidence establishing that Maggie fought with another attacker in a way that would necessarily explain the DNA beneath her nails. The defense disputes the significance of that reasoning. Jim Griffin has pointed to physical circumstances at the crime scene that he believes make further investigation worthwhile. For the defense, the argument is simple. If science has improved since 2021, why not find out whose DNA it is? The state has not completely opposed additional testing. Instead, prosecutors have raised questions about how the evidence should be handled, what procedures should be used, and how results should be shared. That means this dispute may ultimately be less about whether testing happens and more about exactly how it happens. And there is another important point. Even if the testing identifies an unknown man, that would not automatically prove Alex Murdaugh innocent. Investigators would then have to determine who that person is and whether there is an innocent explanation for the DNA. But if the DNA identifies someone who had no obvious reason to have contact with Maggie, the significance could change dramatically. That is why this tiny biological sample could become one of the most watched pieces of evidence in the retrial. Then there is the question of where the new trial should happen. The murders occurred in Colleton County. The original trial took place there. But Alex Murdaugh is not an ordinary defendant in that community. For generations, the Murdaugh family held enormous influence in South Carolina's low country legal system. The first trial attracted national and international attention. Documentaries were produced. Podcasts dissected every development. Millions of people already know the name Alex Murdaugh. His lawyers argue that finding an impartial jury in Colleton County may now be impossible. They have proposed moving the trial to Charleston County. Prosecutors have pushed back specifically against Charleston. They have cited practical problems including traffic, parking, and the enormous media presence likely to descend on the courthouse. Importantly, however, the state has indicated it may be willing to discuss other locations. So the fight may not ultimately be about whether the trial moves. It may be about where it moves. All of this leaves the second Murdaugh trial looking very different from the first. In 2023, the prosecution had a powerful surprise. The kennel video destroyed Alex Murdaugh's original claim that he had not been with Maggie and Paul shortly before their deaths. That surprise is gone. The defense knows exactly how prosecutors used it, but prosecutors also know exactly how Murdaugh tried to explain it. The defense knows the state's financial motive theory. The state knows which parts of its presentation may now face tighter limits. Both sides know the weaknesses the other side exposed in 2023. And now, a new scientific question is being added to the equation: the unidentified DNA. For the prosecution, the core circumstantial case remains formidable. Murdaugh admitted lying about being at the kennels. The kennel video places his voice there shortly before the killings. The state has previously relied on phone data, vehicle data, firearm evidence, and a detailed timeline to argue that he had the opportunity to commit the murders. For the defense, however, a retrial provides a completely different opportunity. They no longer need to convince a court that something went wrong in the first trial. South Carolina's highest court has already ruled that something did. Their task now is to create reasonable doubt in front of a new jury. That could mean questioning investigators, questioning forensic evidence, reducing the impact of Murdaugh's financial crimes, focusing attention on unidentified DNA, and arguing that the original investigation became too focused on Alex Murdaugh too early. The prosecution will likely respond with a much simpler question. If Alex Murdaugh did not kill Maggie and Paul, why did he lie about being at the kennels with them only minutes before they died? That question was devastating in 2023. It may be devastating again, but a second jury will hear the case under different circumstances, different judge, possibly a different county, potentially different DNA evidence, potentially less testimony about financial crimes, and perhaps a major legal fight over whether statements and evidence used to secure the original indictments were accurate. More than 5 years after Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were killed, this case has somehow become unsettled again. A guilty verdict once appeared to have answered the central question. Now the verdict has been erased. Alex Murdaugh is once again legally awaiting trial on the murder charges. And somewhere inside the evidence from Moselle remains a tiny DNA sample belonging to an unidentified man. The defense hopes modern science will give that DNA a name. The prosecution will have to convince a new jury that whatever that result shows, the evidence still leads back to Alex Murdaugh. So the question going into the retrial is no longer simply whether Alex Murdaugh killed his wife and son. It is this: when every piece of evidence is examined again, under new rules, before a new judge and a new jury, will the same case produce the same verdict? Or is there still something at Moselle investigators have not yet explained?